next guest is the former president of Scientology's Narconon Arrowhead. There are a few here on Tegiak, Earth, that can speak with the authority of this architect of a program that claims it can cure drug addicts by having them speak to ashtrays and spending up to 8 hours a day in a sauna. Having lost friends and his wife for questioning the writings of L. Ron Hubbard, he wears his disconnection as a badge of honor and is now blowing the whistle on his former bosses and their abusive program. Welcome to Radio Paul's Radio Rants, Lucas Catton.
Hey, thank you, Paul. Good to be here.
I'm glad to have you. And I just guess we should get right off the bat here. What is wrong with Narconon?
Oh boy, that's a wide open question. I mean, essentially, it is not what it portrays itself to be, and that's the biggest thing. Is that it wants to be considered legitimate. It wants to try and play in the field of legitimate treatment centers, but yet it is stuck only in the design of L. Ron Hubbard and his teachings, and the two don't mix. And so to claim that it does and be something that it's not, just frankly is not okay, let alone the dangerous aspects of it. That's just the main thing, is it's not what it claims to be.
And at one point you were a believer in Narconon, and were you a Scientologist before, or did you become a Scientologist after you got Narconon?
I had been introduced to Scientology. I didn't really start being active in it whatsoever until after I went to Narconon, but it had been shown to me. Somebody tried to start to do some Scientology auditing and possibly read some books, but basically I wasn't having any of it. And after I got into some trouble and was sent out to Narconon, then after that is when I really became a Scientologist.
And what happened where you started to see problems? What types of things were you going through that made you question what was going on, and why did you ultimately wind up leaving?
Well, it was certainly a multi-year process, basically. But, I went from a diehard member. I was involved for more than a decade. 12 years I was involved in Scientology and Narconon. And it was my contributions, my faith in it, so to speak, continued to strengthen throughout the years, up until the point really where I was living in Clearwater near Flag, one of the largest concentrations of Scientologists in the world. And I started to have such intense financial pressure and from people demanding extremely large sums of money, and it started to mount. I started to get frustrated, and then I started catching people in lies as they were coming after me for more and more money, and would say that this place was busy when I had just been there and it wasn't, or trying to say that somebody needed books donated, like a Narconon Center, for example, that the staff needed Scientology books donated to it. When I had just spoken to the director of that center the week before, it said, we have 16 copies of these things that keep showing up, and we need to give them away to somebody. We don't need them. But yet they continue hounding people for money. So that was the beginning, really, for me, of going, hey, something's not right here.
You had a great story about, was it the Colorado org? Somebody was trying to raise money, and you said you had just been there and saw that there was nobody in the building. What was that about?
Yeah, it was Dallas, actually. Yeah, after I quit working for Narconon, I was still a field representative for them, and my ex-wife had begun working with Narconon East US at the time. And so each year Narconon has something called an executive directors conference that they hold in different cities throughout the world. That particular year, it happened to be in Dallas. And Scientology pushes this campaign right now called the Ideal Org, short for organization, Ideal Org campaign, where they spend millions of dollars for a building, then spend millions more to renovate it, and claim that that's going to be the savior for that city. And their internal propaganda campaigns show, lots of people there, but it's kind of all staff and all the same people. They even bus people in from different places. And so this woman called me up and was seeking $50,000 from me. I had already built up a portion of that, roughly half of it, over the years, and she wanted another $25,000 from me. And said, the Ideal Org campaign is fantastic. I just spoke to the director in Dallas, and she said it's booming. It's busier than ever before. And I said, you know what, that's a lie. I was just there last week. It's empty. There's still plastic on the chairs. Half the building, the lights are out. It's not even in use. It's a lie. And that really started to get me to look at even more again after that.
And there was a big moment where you got lied to, or you were asked to lie at an IAS event. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. What it is there are multiple events that are held in Scientology every year. One of them is the International Association of Scientologists event that's held in October in England. And each year, when they're doing these different events, the people who put on the events for the church do what they call data request gathering. And so you have to present information of what made you so fantastic that year. And you are not allowed to show anything, what they call downstat, anything that is not as high as the previous year's statistic. So they were doing lots of event data requests and looking for something. And I had been elected to the executive board over the Oklahoma Substance Abuse Services Alliance, and I was like the vice president. And essentially, somebody in the event data request unit took a picture of me and superimposed a logo from this organization and put it in their magazine and put it in their event video, where the president then, Heber Jentz of Church of Scientology, showed this picture and was supposed to be me speaking at this giant conference for this organization, but yet it was a doctored image that they made up to lie to show to the parishioners, which I was never standing in that place at that time. So it was fake. And I was like, wait a second, that's not the image that I sent.
Yeah.
So that was another big tip that, that again, it's not what they're portraying it to be.
And you also, as I understand it, there's still literature out there with your name and image on it that they're using as promotions. Is that correct?
Yeah. Actually, there was, one of the things that I did when I was president of Arrowhead and worked in different capacities there is I did a lot of article writing and press release and things like that. And so there are a ton of pages still on stopaddiction.com, for example, and even Narconon.org, Narconon International's website, and Narconon-news.org, where they still have press releases that included me from different events or things that I had written or that quoted me. So they haven't gone through and fully purged all of their sites yet.
I guess you can't be that suppressive of a person, if they still have that stuff out there. I want to talk about some of the players. All right, there's this guy that works at Narconon Arrowhead, which has an extremely checkered past, and everybody knows who Gary Smith is, but there's a guy by the name of William Kent McGregor, and he was sued in the 1980s for sexually assaulting a patient under his care, and then he went on to slander her, and then he had $1 million judgment against him, and to my understanding is he blew off the case. It was no big deal to him. And I have to ask, if I was in charge of Narconon, I wouldn't let this guy anywhere near the property. But you had indicated that not only is he allowed on the property, Scientology is fully aware and Narconon's fully aware of his checkered past. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, they're absolutely fully aware of it. In fact, it had been communicated to me when I first met Kent. I didn't know of the past and the situation. He and his wife Yetta were just coming back from Denmark at the time, and it was made aware to me, and then I wound up seeing it actually on a website that was critical of Narconon that talked about it. It was the first time that I saw it, and then I spoke with somebody afterwards, and they were totally aware of it. And he's been an integral part of the field representative team for Narconon Arrowhead for several years now, minimally. And before that, he's worked with, he did some consulting work with Narconon of Georgia. He did some work with Narconon Vista Bay. He was involved as a car surveyor. That's how he first got involved with Narconon through the accreditation group when he came out to Narconon Chilocco, Oklahoma, back in, I believe, 1991.
And Gary Smith is fully aware of sexual assault and defamation and all this.
Yes, absolutely.
And Gary Smith allows him on the property.
Absolutely.
And I also understand that he has a history of, ripping off people that he works with. In fact, I understand he ripped off Mary Reiser for about $5,000. Is that accurate, or to your knowledge, or?
Yeah, when she was first trying to become incorporated in the state of Georgia, she had actually hired him as being her clinical director, and she had paid him $5,000 consulting fee or somewhere about that, possibly a little bit more. And when she went through, she was not aware of his prior court case, apparently. And he came through and started doing some meetings with some state officials. And one of the state officials actually contacted Mary and said, look, there's no way you're going to get your application approved with this guy as your clinical director. And so she was then made aware of his past at that point, had to essentially fire him, even though he had only begun working for her, but he refused to return the money that she had prepaid him for his services that he never rendered.
And as I understand it, that's actually not uncommon for him. There have been other examples of him having issues where he owes people money and he hasn't paid them. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. And typically, and I certainly don't want to harp on one person individually, but, I at one point was working with Kent as well, and I had a similar experience where I was about to have a baby and was doing most of the work, and he said, look, as soon as the baby comes, you can take a couple months off and I'll repay you for all the work that you've done, and it didn't happen. In fact, I was losing money at the time, and so I had to split the partnership right then and there after basically a few weeks, because I could tell that he was only out for himself and wasn't going to repay that. Narconon Vista Bay out in Northern California refused to continue working with him. Narconon Georgia refused to continue working with him. Novus Detox, he was hired to consult and do a licensing setup when Novus Detox down in Florida was first opening up, and they failed the inspection based on the paperwork that he had submitted. And he thought that they were going to sue him. He actually told me, he said, I was afraid that Steve was the founder, one of the founders of Novus Detox. He said, I was afraid Steve was going to sue me. He said they gave him $5,000 up front, and they were supposed to give him another $5,000 after they got their certification, and they wound up having to let him go and go through the certification process themselves. So there's many different people, even within their own internal network, that won't deal with him anymore.
And yet he's still allowed on the property. Now, for the listeners, Mary Reiser is Georgia, and she was recently publicly condemned by a judge for lying along with Narconon in depositions. And in fact, there was a major ruling where she's going to, I guess, instruct a jury to disregard all of their testimony as false. And that kind of leads us to the next major player at Narconon Arrowhead, which is Gary Smith. And Gary Smith has said things like, oh, well, we fire and turn over staff that do drugs, and yet they have this thing called re-stems, or not re-stems, they have, I forget what they call it, where a staff member, a repair, where if a staff member does drugs again, they get to go through the program again. And that is not the same thing as turning them over and having them be arrested. And I was wondering, what are some other blatant kind of lies you've heard Gary Smith make?
Well, some of them, for example, saying that that they believe that they're fully in compliance with the law in the state of Oklahoma. They were absolutely scared, knowing that they were not any longer in compliance with the laws in the state of Oklahoma, which is what sparked, this was toward the end of my tenure there, what sparked a multi-year process of trying to work with the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services again, because the law had changed where the health department no longer issued or no longer had any kind of oversight over treatment centers or rehabilitation facilities. And they were allowed to operate fully legally prior to that with a health department inspection and then their CARF accreditation. Well, once the health department inspection no longer was valid because they had no jurisdiction anymore, they had to fall under some oversight of a state agency. And so they worked out this quasi deal with the Oklahoma Department